Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Improving Talks. We're so happy you were able to join us today. Today, we are going to be hearing from Eric Sowell. Eric is a principal consultant out of our Dallas enterprise, and he will be talking to us about the lessons learned from teaching adult developers. The topic today is one near and dear to my heart. Eric and I are both big fans of the various programs we run at Improving, and so I'm excited to hear him talk about them today. Also, we are always looking for great new people to join our team at Improving, and right now we need UI, Scrum Master, iOS, Android, .NET, Java, you name it, we need it. And so if you're interested, please check out improving.com's careers section, or feel free to reach out directly to Eric if you'd like to be recommended in. His name and information are right there on the screen in front of you. With that said, Eric, thank you for speaking with us today, and I'll give it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Thanks to everybody who came. If you've got questions or comments throughout this, feel free to just put those in. I've already told Tim that I can be interrupted at any point in this whole process. So please ask those questions. I'd love to answer any that I can. And so I'm here to talk about educating adult developers. My very first presentation at a technology user group was in 2009. It was on the first version of ASP.NET MVC. Since then, I've spoken at a number of different user groups. I've led workshops inside companies. I've taught full-time, either at doing boot camps or accelerators, and I've done one-on-one mentoring. And so I really enjoy the teaching space. I really enjoy software development too, but if I had my choice, I'd be teaching. And since I've been doing it a lot, I've also, as it turns out, made a lot of mistakes. So I'm going to share what I've learned, both from my mistakes, but also from working with other really good teachers and reading educational literature. And so here is the basic areas that we're going to go through in this. And so here's the big picture. We're going to start with some universals, some basic principles that are going to apply in pretty much all situations. Then we're going to focus a little bit on working with individuals. And so this would be the kind of situation when you're working with a junior dev who's trying to get into their career, or if you're working with someone at work who's a senior and they just need a little bit of guidance. Next, we're going to talk about structured group learning. And this is going to come in multiple different forms, and we'll talk about those when we get there. And then finally, I'll mention some resources, some books I've read that I've found very, very useful. So let's get started talking about the universals. So the first thing, whenever I'm going to be mentoring someone, whether this is individually or in a group, we're going to talk about who is responsible. And though as a teacher or as a mentor, I will have some responsibilities guiding or teaching, the primary responsibility, and this should be stressed with them, should always be on the learner. Learning is an active thing, all right? They should be the ones who are most concerned about their own learning. And so this should come up as a part of the discussion, all right? They should be encouraged to say, hey, you take charge of your own learning, even if this is in a classroom scenario. Even in those cases, they should be told, hey, you're the learner. Learning is your responsibility. And if we think about this stress on active learning, all right, imagine the guy on the left, right? Let's say he's not watching TV. Let's say he's watching a Pluralsight course on C#, or maybe he's on a Cloud Guru, or he's watching something on YouTube. Let's say he's watching that video on C# and he's seeing some new C# features and he's just sitting there relaxing. How much is he going to learn from that? What that is good for is at least exposing this person to what that is. Take the picture on the right though. Someone actually using the new features in code. That's really how learning is going to happen. So when you're talking to someone, once again, individually or in a classroom scenario, always stress active learning. Sure, go watch those Udemy courses. But if you watch those Udemy courses and then you don't code and then you don't try that thing, you're not really learning. So that's something very important to stress to everyone whenever they're trying to learn and get better at their programming. Now you, as the potential mentor or the friend or the teacher, you can provide something really unique in these kind of situations. So this is really a message for you. Being a friend, being someone that they can just talk to and bounce ideas off of is actually extremely helpful in these kind of situations. Can you learn something just by watching YouTube videos? Sure you can. Can you learn something by watching YouTube videos and then putting it in practice? Yes, that's going to even be better. But what's even better is if they get stuck on something and they have somebody to talk to about it. Someone who can perhaps help them get past a spot where they're stuck or help them get a bigger picture. And so even though it's, I think, the students or the person being the mentee, it is primarily their duty to learn, you can play an extremely important part in that by being that little rubber ducky that they talk to whenever they really just can't get past this strange error from ASP.NET that they're seeing. You can be that friend that they need. And another universal I would want to point out is this. Generally speaking, favor shorter over longer commitments. So let's say you're working with somebody individually. What should you do? Should you lay out a plan for, I don't know, a 2-year plan for their development? Maybe in generalities. But when it comes to really coming up with an action plan, favor shorter periods of commitment over longer periods of commitment. It's very hard for people to commit to something and then stick with it for a very long time. This is one of the problems with commitments that you make at the beginning of the year. This year, I'm going to do X or I'm going to do Y. That's a whole long time that you can fail, essentially, and get discouraged in that process. And so meet with them. And if this developer or group of developers, they want to get better at, I don't know, Azure, say, okay, let's come up with a 1-month plan. Let's come up with a 2-month plan for us to learn these things. And let's make a commitment to do that, whether that's individuals or that's groups. And so those are some universals there. And here they are once again. Establish responsibility, and the responsibility for learning should be on the learner. That doesn't mean you're inactive as the mentor or the teacher. You might be extremely active in the case of someone who's running a classroom, but learning is their responsibility and they should know that. Stress active learning. What we do as a career is very active. We build things, we make things. Get them making things as a part of their learning. It's very easy for people to sit back and watch videos and think, I'm learning. Don't allow that. Stress that active learning. Be that friend when they're stuck or they need some encouragement. And favor shorter sprints over long hauls in terms of, now let's get this thing done. Now some things about working specifically with individuals. When you're working with an individual, they should choose their own goal. When you're in a group scenario, that's important too, but I think in this particular case, it's especially important. When you're mentoring another developer, or you're just the manager for that developer, and you're supposed to be there for them in their mentoring and in their learning, they should be the ones choosing their goal, if at all possible. Why? Because when you have something intrinsically that you want, you automatically have more motivation to accomplish that goal. You're going to go, I want to learn a thing. But if you come in and say, I know you want to learn X, but I want you to learn Y, it's already harder for them already at that point. And so primarily when you're working with an individual, they should be setting their own goals. Now that asterisk is there because there's some caveats to this. And that is, if you're working with a very junior developer, let's say someone who just wants to get into programming, all right? They are actually not going to understand, chances are, what they actually want to learn. They want to learn development. Okay, well, what does that mean? Do they want to be a back-end developer? Do they want to be a front-end developer? Do they even know what the difference is between a back-end and a front-end developer? Chances that's not going to be the case. And so often as a mentor, you're going to be there to guide them, not to change their goal, all right, but to help them specify and go a particular direction. That's going to be super important, especially for the more younger developers. For the more experienced developers, much less guidance is needed because they're in the industry. They already know a lot of things. And they can go, I want to get better at Azure. Okay, great. You can still be there for them. You can encourage them. You can help them make their plans. You can be that guy or that girl who's just reminding them, hey, how's your goal? Are you getting towards your goal? They can choose that themselves, but you can be that encouragement along the way. So depending on who you're working with, you're going to need to help a little bit more or less in helping them find their goal. And even for experienced developers, they're often going to want to talk and decide, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, but I'm also thinking about this. What do you think? And you can be there to help them on that. But the goal should come from them. And then once you come up with that goal, have them write down their plan. This is very important. This functions as a commitment device. Because they've written down that plan, it's sort of like saying, I'm serious about this. And them writing down their plan isn't quite enough. What you should do is revisit it with them periodically. Have them say, this is my plan. And then, I don't know, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, come back and say, hey, how are you doing with your plan? Are you making progress towards your goal? Not in a guilt trippy sort of way. That may or may not be helpful, depends on the person, but in an encouraging sort of way. How are you doing towards your goal? Help them with their own commitments by encouraging them to write down their plan, and as a mentor and as a friend, revisit it with them periodically to give them that encouragement that they're going to need. So with working with individuals, along with the universal guidance, they should, generally speaking, choose their own goal, but be there to guide because they might need it, or at the very least, they might just want a sounding board. And also have them write down their plan and be that person who revisits it with them periodically to encourage them along the way. So that's the major notes about working with individuals. Now let's talk about working with groups. Here's 3 different scenarios. There's a lot of overlap in these 3 different scenarios, but there's some unique challenges. What about if you want to, say, teach a 3-day lab on some technology at work? Elasticsearch, Azure, whatever. You're going to teach a 3-day lab, all right? What can you do to make this a good experience? We're going to be talking about that. What if you're going to be teaching a multi-month boot camp? All right, you are going to take a few future developers from nothing to being a junior developer in 3 months. All right, I've done this. This is really hard, but it's also really fun. And so I'm going to talk about some things related to that. And there's another scenario that I'm still trying to get a lot better at. And it's this one, which is teaching a hands-on session at a technology meetup. I mentioned earlier, I've been speaking at user groups for quite a long time. That can be challenging. It can be a little nerve-wracking. Making and doing a hands-on session at a technology meetup, that's a whole nother level of stress. And so I'll talk a little bit about that later. A lot of these things will apply, these teaching in groups, to all of these scenarios. And so let's jump into these. But first, caveat. A lot of people who get into technology teaching, they come into that because they've been speakers at user groups. That's actually how I got into teaching at first. I had written a book and I had been speaking at a lot of user groups in the local market. And the company that I worked for as a coding bootcamp instructor, they looked at local user groups and saw that I was speaking, and so they contacted me. And so that's where I came from. I've got a few warnings for you. Something to think about before you move into the world of teaching. and it's this one. First of all, the focus is on them learning and not you talking. Now, in the user group scenario, often you're stressed, you're working on what you're going to talk about. You're like, okay, I got to connect these things. I got to say these things well. I got to present this well. And that's important. And that's important when doing group training as well. However, that should not be the focus. The focus is not on you. The focus is actually on them and preparing activities and preparing learning experiences for them that will help them learn. A 3-month boot camp is not 90 days of speeches, right? That is a very bad way of approaching teaching a boot camp. And because of my background as a speaker, I thought, well, if I just give a bunch of really awesome user group presentations, then these will be some awesome developers at the end of this. This was a massive mistake. This is absolutely the worst mistake I made, and the first time I was doing full-time teaching. And also, it's very important for you to appreciate that programming and educating are different skill sets. Educating, they have degrees for that sort of thing. I didn't get one of those degrees. Good news is there are teachers out there you can talk to, and there are books you can read. And for me, it was really for becoming a better educator. It was a combination of going, teaching, realizing, wow, they're not learning. What am I doing wrong? Reading books, talking to other teachers, and learning in the process. Just like everything we do, we have to do things to learn them. But appreciate that educating and programming are not the same. You may be an awesome programmer. That does not mean you're going to be able to teach people automatically. So go ahead and take on that task of learning a little bit about education. And I'll have some books later you can start with. So with those things in mind, let's talk around a few areas in working with groups. First, I want to talk about creating content for these groups. When you're doing content planning, it's very important for you to do what is called sometimes backwards planning or backwards design. What you do is you begin with the end in mind. What do you want that group of developers to be able to do? Do you want them to be able to contribute on a team using Git, which means they need to, what do they need to know to do that? Well, if you think about the team scenario, and that means they need to know, okay, how do I merge? How do I rebase? How do I do this sort of things? But you don't start with that, right? Then you back up. Well, what do they need to know if they will need to be able to merge? Well, that means they're going to need to be able to pull, right? Well, what do they need to know about pulling? Well, they need to know something about commits. They need to know about pushing. They need to know about adding. They need to know about all of those things in Git. So you start with the end in mind. What do they need to be able to do? And you work backwards to try to find a place to start. One thing I like to do when I'm thinking about new content is I like to do mind mapping and go, okay, if there's a thing that they need to know, I will start with that mind map of that thing and go, what do they need to know that? And do that once, then take a break for a day or two, then come back and do that same mind map, combine the two, and you will probably have a pretty good idea of the things that they're going to need to learn to get there. So begin with the end in mind in terms of content. Backwards plan. What do they need to do all the way back to where they need to start? Lesson number 2, create lesson plans for yourself. So many times I taught, I did not create lesson plans. I've got an example lesson plan over here on the left. This is a lesson I did on programming against the DOM. And so they had a little JavaScript at this point. Of course, they had HTML, they've had CSS at this point. And so I was going to do essentially a 1-hour session. And a 1-hour session was not a 1-hour lecture. It was a 1-hour session of me talking and them doing things along with me or after me. And so I would create this lesson plan. It might go something like this. First of all, I'm going to establish my goals for that particular lesson. And I might tell them if it would make sense to them. If no one has ever heard of the DOM, telling them, hey, we're going to talk about the DOM is not going to mean a whole lot, but maybe it's at least worth saying so they know that you have a plan and that you're going somewhere. And so I'd create lesson plans, and these would have little notes on content, but they would also have activities, and we'll get to activities in a minute. My favorite activity, partially because it's the one of the easiest to do, is the mimic, where you code something and they code along, or you code and then they code. Right? You code and they watch you while you code, then they code, and they are basically doing exactly what you're doing or doing something very similar to what you're doing. And so create the lesson plans. Why would you want to do this? Well, it's actually super handy. First of all, if you ever teach the class again, you don't have to remember, what did I talk about? What activities did I use to help them learn these concepts? You don't have to do any of that because you've got your previous lesson plans. So that's super handy. Also, if you print these out, you can have them in class or session, whatever you want to call it. You can have them there and you can put notes. Sometimes I would actually time activities, and I would put in my lesson plan, I'd say, okay, I think this activity is going to take 15 minutes. And so as a part of the lesson, I would actually time myself in sections and go, well, I actually finished that in 5 minutes. I was way off. Or that took 45 minutes because they didn't quite get something as fast as I thought they would. And so this becomes an asset for you to use, but also something that you can use to take notes on, so you can, after the fact, think through and go, okay, what went poorly? What did I do poorly in my planning? And this can help you in the future. And so, big fan of lesson plans. And another effect of this is, if you think about how you're going to approach that 1 or 2 hours of lessons, or 3 hours, however long it's going to be, if you do this at least a day before you actually do the presentation, your mind starts thinking about it. It's stuck in the back of your brain, and as you're commuting, if you do that these days, as you're just taking a walk, your brain thinks on these things and other ideas pop up, and it sort of lets you subconsciously think through what you're going to do. Very helpful for all of these reasons. Handy for notes, handy for the next time you teach this, which might be 6 months to a year later, and you won't remember, and also handy for helping you think through and mentally prep for it. And then, of course, if you do get nervous in talks, having a little bullet point script can be super handy as well. Something to put, and this would be something to put as a part of your lesson planning at the very least, is build in ways to check for understanding. Here's how you don't check for understanding. Hey there, student. Did you understand what I said? Chances are they will say yes, or I think so. It's not what I'm talking about. Check for understanding. What you need to do, essentially, is go, all right, I'm teaching concepts. How long do I want to go before I know if they got it? Do I want to go, ideally, do I want to go days before I know that they understood something? Do I want to go weeks? No. Do I want to go hours? Well, ideally, you would want to know immediately. Do they understand the thing that I'm talking to them about? How are you going to do that? Asking is not a good way of knowing that. How do you do it? Well, if you read primary school literature, as strangely enough, I now do, they have, for example, some nice activity names like do nows. One thing I liked to do when I was teaching was whenever they'd show up to class, I would have a 15-minute exercise. And this would often have to do with what they did the next day. If they could do the exercise, I knew at that point they understood. Or if you want to know before then, how about the exit ticket? Instead of at the beginning of the day, after you've done a day's worth of lecturing and exercising, have an activity towards the end that's specifically targeted for the things that you discussed that day. And you would know, based on that work, oh, they understood everything I talked about today, ready to move on. Or you might go, I really thought I nailed that content. I clearly didn't, because no one understood it. And so you would know then at the end of the day, and you can go, okay, Well, apparently I'm going to need to revisit this the next day, because ideally what you want to know as soon as possible is, are they tracking with me? All right. Do they understand? Now, another basic concept. Think about somebody when they're learning. They could be in their comfort zone, right? Learning something, C# for me is comfort zone. I know the language pretty well, all right? It still might be new to me, but it's not going to push me if you show me a new feature I haven't used before. Well, probably not anyway. All right. There's the comfort zone. What we don't want to do is we don't want learners really in the comfort zone, because it's not really where they're going to excel. We also don't want them in the panic zone either. All right. Hey, let's learn AWS. I'm going to throw IAM at you all in one day. You're going to understand everything. That'll probably get a lot of developers into a panic zone, because there's a lot to that. Panic zone, when someone's panicking over, oh no, I got to learn this, often their brains start shutting down and they're going to learn more slowly. That's not where you want people. Where you want people, though, is in what you might call the learning zone. All right. I've heard this explained to me as +1 or an increment. All right. Give them a little bit. Give them enough that challenges them, that pushes them. Sure, review some things that they know, but be pushing a little bit where they're not just, I'm just reviewing. Push them a little bit so they're, okay, I'm learning this new thing this time. I'm learning this new thing this time. What you don't do is throw a whole lot at them at one time and make them panic, because when that happens, the learning shuts down. Now, just a second ago, we were talking about developers, and I said, hey, if you want to understand if your students know what's going on, don't ask them. That's actually not a very good way of knowing that. However, one of the best ways of knowing if someone's in the panic zone is, in fact, to ask them. One thing that we did, for example, in an accelerator that we taught last year is, of course, we would have plenty of time during the day where you could talk to a student, but every Friday we had a meeting between me, the teacher, and the student. And just, it's a how you doing kind of meeting. All right. This was not how I was trying to see if they understood what I was talking about. They're going to want to not be embarrassed and say, oh yeah, I understood it. Or they might want to impress me and go, oh yeah, I understood it. I'm a good student. That's not what that's not a good way to know if they understood. However, having those conversations were very useful for just seeing how people were from an emotional standpoint. Is this learner emotionally in a good place? If they're panicking, they're not. And just like checking for understanding, you want to know as soon as possible if someone is panicking. If you've gone 3 weeks of class and someone's been panicking and you don't know, that means that you might have just had 3 weeks of wasted learning time. And so build in practices, all right, in terms of whatever you do with the class, but also in terms of your content. Don't ramp up the content too quickly, all right? Little piece at a time, adding on, keeping them out of their comfort zone, but not putting them into the panic zone, if at all possible. And this one right here is probably the most difficult thing in terms of planning content, and that is, if at all possible, plan for differing levels of ability. If you take a group of people, you're going to have some sort of curve, perhaps a bell curve, where you're going to usually have some people that you're teaching will excel. For them, you're going to be useful because you're giving them useful information. You're guiding their learning. But primarily what's driving them is their desire, their own personal drive, and they just get things. That's one side. So you'll often have those kind of folks. You'll also potentially have some folks who are struggling, while some are really conquering everything you throw at them and you're like, wow. Some might struggle and might not be able to follow along. How do you have these two groups of people in the same classroom? And then often you'll have a larger chunk of people in the middle they're taking on the new content, but if you push them any further, you're going to push them potentially into the panic zone. What do? My typical approach to this is, generally speaking, you aim towards the middle of the group. You try to hit that, generally speaking, larger group of people that are able to take in the new material, perhaps not crush it immediately, but take in that material, and that's where you focus your material. What you can do also, and this is one reason why this is difficult, because creating content for classes is time consuming and difficult. Prepare sidebar items for your more advanced students. Now, the way to do this don't let them work ahead in your current material. That is not the way to do it, because if you let those who are more expert, if you let those who are learning more quickly go ahead of you, then you're actually going to make the process worse, because you're basically setting them up for even greater potential levels of boredom as they wait for others. Instead, what you do is you have something on the side. Oh, well, we're learning front-end development. Okay, but well, you are kind of bored. I had a student once that told me this. He came to me. It was a front-end development class. He said, "Hey, this is a great class, but I'm bored. I need more to do." All right, this is kind of a good problem. And so what I did with this developer was, we'll tell you what, I'm not going to push you further in front-end development. I'm going to work with you through a book on Node.js and start learning some back-end development. And so that way they still get to not be bored, and they still get to make good progress, but you're not going to cause issues later. And for those on the end of the curve that are struggling, if you can, have practices, have exercises for them to go through that'll be good review exercises. In the primary school literature, some of it I read, they called it at-bats. Have a bunch of things that they can just pick up and do, just to work on their skills and try to catch up with the rest of the class. So review exercises for those who are struggling. A side quest, I guess would be a way of saying it, for those who are not challenged enough by your material. And everybody else in the middle, just work on keeping them in that learning zone, not panicking, but also not bored.
So Eric, the question
Yes,
for you before you move on here, this really does highlight, I think, the importance perhaps of, in a classroom environment when you're not teaching one-on-one, how important is how you compose the group to begin with, right? How you compose your group of learners, what's an acceptable spread of skill to begin with, right? Because this definitely, what you're saying here implies that you don't want a wildly divergent set of skills in the room, right, with the material you're teaching.
Yeah, and this is such a hard problem to solve, right? Let's say, scenario-wise, you're going to start a boot camp, all right? You're going to start a boot camp, and it's going to have 12 people in it. It is very difficult to know on the front end where people are going to land on that spectrum of crushing it to struggling. Ideally, you're going to want, if you can do it, everyone at the very least in the productive learning group, not the panicking group. That's ideally what you want, all right? And if you have some who are just need more work to do, then okay, side quests are good. But you can look at this distribution, and I think that would be basically ideal. But you can look at this distribution as a good check upon what you're doing in terms of your class. If it's not a bell curve, if you don't have most people in that doing okay kind of category, then you need to radically change what you're doing from a classroom standpoint, because generally speaking, most should be there. If everyone is in the "this is all easy" category, we need more work, then you know what, you're just not challenging them. So that's a problem in classroom planning. If almost everyone is in the struggling category, then that's also a problem for the teacher, because what you've done is you've put too much on them. And so ideally, what you're going to do is aim for having a big, strong middle group, because that, I think, is going to show that, all right, this material is sufficiently challenging, but not something that, not too challenging that the group can't handle it. But this is such a difficult problem of recruiting, having someone coming into software development scenario without any previous experience, and being able to look at them and go, okay, this is going to work well for you. It's a hard problem. But that's generally what I would look for, because this can be a sign for, as a teacher, how you're doing in terms of your content creation. If there's any more questions on that, please ask them again. That'd be good. Another thing you should do as a teacher is you should provide them a map. They should know where they're going. If you don't provide a map, it might just seem like this endless maze of, I'm going to learn this, I'm going to learn that, because as you know, as developers, learning software development is like this endless pile of trivia. You got to know so many little bitty things to be a developer, and all those things have to start clicking together. And as you build this map in your brain of how software development works, well, they don't have that map. Provide them a map. Here's the things we're going to learn. Weeks 1 and 2, we're going to learn this. Weeks 3 and 4, we're going to learn this. Give them an idea that there is actually an end in mind. And when you do that, show them their progress as they go along. And so they can see, oh, well, we're going to learn all these things, and a few weeks in, we've made progress on these things, because yes, we do in fact know these. This will also give them at the very least, a subconscious idea that, oh, my teacher isn't just winging it. They actually do have a plan, which as a teacher, it is very important that you're not winging it. This is a good way of showing, I'm not winging it. I have a plan, and we're taking you through a nice progression as we go. And so provide a map and show them their progress. Now I want to talk a little bit about running a classroom. So those are some content ideas. Next is, okay, you've made your content. All right, you've been thinking about, all right, they need to learn Git, they need to learn ASP.NET, they need to learn C#, SQL Server. You've done some backwards planning. Now let's talk about running the classroom. Let's start with the bow tie. The bow tie is sometimes called ratio, or sometimes called I, we, you planning. And you could think of this as an entire course. You could think of this as an entire day. You could also think of this in terms of an hour-long session, all right? And it's basically this. The ratio should go from the teacher being extremely active and the student not, to the teacher's active and the student's active, and then finally, where the teacher is done and all the activity is coming from the student, right? If the teacher is doing everything, doing all the coding, doing all the talking, that's passive learning. Going back to that thing we talked about earlier. That's not ideal, but that is sometimes where you have to start, because you can give them, oh, here's the syntax, or here's the big picture. That's a great place to start, but it should never stay that way. Think about your session. Okay, at what point do I transition from me talking to them doing something with me helping them? And then think about, okay, I'm helping them. Now, how do I transition them out of me helping them to just them working by themselves? Because that's crucial. And so you can use this as a rubric for what's my day, what's my week, what's my hour like in terms of working with the students. And this will also help you from getting in speech mode too much. The student needs to be active. Can't start that way, but it absolutely should end that way. I picked this picture because I actually got a lot out of reading education material from primary school. Let's talk about activities. And I've got one book to recommend later on that's meant for, you're a math teacher in 7th grade. Believe it or not, quite relevant in terms of thinking through student activities. Well, whenever you're teaching some sort of course, I recommend that you vary the activities, especially if it's a long course. I mean, if you're doing a user group talk and you're going to have them for 2 hours, that's not important. If you're with somebody for a few days, that's not so important. If you're going to be with somebody and a group of people for 3 months, you should really come up with some different types of activities. This can help improve the pacing in the class and help keep them from getting bored. Oh, it's just another one of these activities over and over and over again. I've already mentioned the mimic. This one's easy because essentially what you do is you code and you show that how the thing works, and then they mimic what you're doing, either exactly or very, very similar. So this is an easy activity for us as a developer and matches very closely to what they would actually have to do. I'm writing code, now you write code that does the same thing. It's a good default activity, but not the only one you should use. Pair programming is another good activity. Put people together to work on problems instead of somebody always working by themselves. And when you do this, pair them up with people randomly. One of the things I did in the accelerator that we ran last year is when we were in the section on DOM programming, because I was reviewing some things, even though everyone there had some experience with DOM programming, I was reviewing something, and one of the things I did was built a student randomizer pairer. And so I would start an activity, pull up that thing that we had written together and say, all right, now here's who you're going to pair with. And so I did that a lot to them. Do group projects. In real world development, as you probably know, most of the time you're working with somebody else. If you're creating an educational experience, they should get used to that. Now, if they're already experienced developers, you don't necessarily need to put them on a group project. They're used to this kind of thing. But if they're young developers, getting them to work with others is very crucial. Not only because they're getting used to team dynamics and working with others, but also because, well, if they're going to use source control, they've got to learn how to use source control as a group. And that's different than using source control by yourself. And so create some group projects. It's going to teach them some things and ways of working that they would not be able to learn otherwise. Do code reviews. This might be your code, or it might be the student's homework. Go through it. If you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, then, code review someone who did a good job. And so you can put their code up and talk about it and say, hey, look at what a good job they did. Or you could use your code. Either way. Work in an existing project. This is another thing. Usually a developer is not going to be able to go in and create something from scratch for work. It happens, but more often than not, they're going to go work in an existing project. Well, give them one. Give them an activity. Have them pull down a code base and go, okay, here's a code base. Now you're going to extend it, as opposed to creating something from scratch. Both should certainly be done. Not just working in an existing project. Actually, it's actually a super important skill to learn how to start from scratch. But if you're just starting from scratch, then you're not mimicking the real world. And once again, working in an existing project, if you're working with experienced developers, they already know this kind of stuff. And so that's not really necessary. Focus in that case on you're working independently. Treasure hunt. And this activity is very good for young developers. And that is say, all right, you're going to learn how to do a thing. All right, you're going to learn how to do DOM manipulation. You're going to learn how to do Flexbox. You've got 10 minutes. Go find good resources and review those resources as a group. Googling is a skill, an important skill for developers, and practicing it is a good idea. Another related activity, which is not on here, called needle in a haystack. Give them a problem and then give them a Stack Overflow post that has the answer to the problem in it, but the Stack Overflow post is not itself an answer to the problem and go find the answer in there. Once again, something that we have to do all of the time. And finally, just another activity would be fix my bad code. You give them something that is broken and you're like, okay, this is broken. Hey, will you fix it for me? Help me debug this, because this is, once again, going to be a very real world scenario where you're going in and you have to read someone else's bad code and try to fix it. This and a lot of other activities that you could probably come up with just by practice or by, once again, it's a weird suggestion, but totally read, how to teach elementary school kids how to do writing assignments. You can come up with activities that can vary the kind of things that they need to be doing and can really improve the pacing and the variety in your classes. Now, if you're going to teach like a 3-day session, the scenarios we had, a 3-day session at work on technology X, all right, and teaching for example, a boot camp of people who've never done any programming before, or a 3-month accelerator where they've done some, but they're going to be focusing on a piece of technology. Those are, in many ways, they're different in many ways, but there's a lot of overlap there. The most difficult scenario I've found so far is not those, and that would be to teach a hands-on session at a technology meetup. To me, there's like a special level of difficulty there. I've done it a number of times, and it can be successful, but it's hard. And so I want to talk about that as a different scenario real quick. Special problems. And this is a picture of the North Dallas Developer Group right here. One of the user groups I've worked the most with. One of the problems with user groups and meetups is there's no common starting place. You've got a bunch of random people in a room. All right. If you're going to do something hands-on related, where's your starting place with a hugely diverse group of people, potentially anyway? So that's a problem. 2, you don't know their skill levels. If you're teaching at work, let's say you've been there and you're going to teach a three-day class on Elasticsearch, all right? Since you've worked with these people, you know their skill level and you can plan for that. In a classroom scenario, when you're starting, let's say a boot camp, you won't know their skill level, but you'll know it pretty soon, all right? In these cases, no, you don't know their skill levels. No clue, generally speaking, because you will, in my experience, you'll plan these and suddenly a bunch of people who've never shown up in the user group before, you have no idea who they are, they will show up and now you have to be ready to handle this. Another issue, you have a very short period of time, right? You're teaching a multi-day workshop at work, you've got a few days to tweak and make sure it's right. You're doing a hands-on lab at a user group with a bunch of random people. You've got an hour and a half or 2 hours to get it figured out. That's tough, actually. Do they need to have something installed? Should they have an account already for AWS? If you're going to teach them how to do something in AWS, we did that once. That can cause some issues, right? Because some people might show up without having something installed, or they might not have ever set up an account for what they needed. Special problems. What can you do in this particular case? Generally speaking, you're going to have an easier time of this if you focus on getting started on a technology. All right. If you're going to try to do a hands-on lab at a technology user group, don't start with, all right, advanced Elasticsearch. All right. Not the right place to start. More like start at the beginning. All right. Not advanced CSS. More like, let's do a little session on getting started with Flexbox. Maybe assume they know a little bit of CSS, but not a whole lot. All right. Not advanced React. You can do a lecture on that. Hands-on lab, that's going to be tough. Beginning React, I've done that one as a hands-on lab. It can work. Thing that all those have in common are getting started with a thing, because you want to limit the amount of or I guess you should say, you want to limit what they have to know to basically get started as much as possible anyway. Have helpers. Depending on the size of the group, you're going to have a different number of people struggling. And if you have helpers that can walk around the group, I know this is kind of going back to the days when we had lots of in-person user groups. If you have helpers who can walk around and sit with them at their computer and say, oh, well, here's your syntax error, that can be hugely helpful. We did a beginning React session, and I had 4 or 5 people in a group of probably about 60 learners. I had 4 or 5 people who could float in the room and help me while they're working on labs, right? I've talked to them. Now they have a task to work on. Having multiple people milling around and helping others can be hugely helpful in making that a successful activity. Produce materials for take home. It's a really nice pressure release valve to be able to say, hey, we're going to do this hands-on lab. If halfway through the hands-on lab, you get lost and you can't get caught up, here's materials for you to take home. And so when I did this for React, what I did is I basically recorded a little screencast doing every single activity that they were going to do during that session. And so if they got stuck along the way, it was actually okay. I could say, glad you're here. It's not wasted. Keep paying attention. But if you can't keep up, the materials are there for you when you're done. Of course, this does put an extra burden on the presenter in preparing materials, but it is super helpful for giving them that safety net, just in case there ends up being problems. Also, the simpler tools you need, the better. All right, they shouldn't have to install 15 things. They should have to install maybe 1 or 2. That's very, very important. Last section would be, I want to talk about just some books. And these are all going to be useful for you. I think if you want to get into teaching, if you've done some teaching, I'm telling you, these are still going to be useful for you. I didn't read any of these until I finished my first full-time coding boot camp, and it was eye-opening. These are very helpful for me. I'd recommend if you're going to be doing some teaching, then you should read them beforehand. This one is really great. Now, this is not about programming. Actually, none of these books are about programming. These are all just about educating. How to teach adults. This is fantastic. I felt as I came out of that class and I thought about what went well and what went poorly. As I was reading this, I'm like, oh, hey, you're talking about me. This is kind of painful. This is a good book, and I would definitely recommend this book. And if I recall correctly, this is really hitting the college level, but it certainly works. This book is great as well, Training from the Back of the Room. One of the things you need to do, getting back to that theme of a good educational experience is not you talking, is how do you get them more active in the learning? What kind of activities can you do so you can step aside and let them do things? And so this book was very, very useful. And this is that book on elementary or primary school education I thought was very, very useful for me. And I just picked this one randomly off Amazon because I, at the time, didn't really know anybody to ask, hey, I want a good book on activities for children to see if I can learn something from this. I found something on Amazon and I'm going to try it. I actually read the 2.0 book. I didn't want to buy it because I thought Teach Like a Champion 2.0, that's a really dumb title for a book. It was very cringy. Feelings of Web 2.0 kind of thing going on. But this book was actually fantastic. And when preparing for this discussion, I noticed there's a 3.0, even though apparently they only had one new technique. I think I might actually have to get me another copy of this and try it out. Once again, not about coding. What it is about is just techniques to help students learn. And believe it or not, there's a whole lot of overlap between primary school skill building and programming skill building. Different topics entirely. But in terms of techniques, you can learn a lot from this. And finally, this is a book I actually just read a few months ago. We have internal book clubs here at Improving. And This book isn't per se about a classroom at all. What it is about, though, is education. And it is about helping users feel awesome when they're learning to use whatever tool you happen to be making. When I read this, because I'm in teacher mode pretty much all the time, when I just kept going, all right, how does this apply to the classroom? And there was a lot in there that was applicable to the classroom. So those are all 4 resources that would be really good. How to Teach Adults, Training for the Back of the Room, Teach Like a Champion 3.0, terrible title, good book. And this book, badass. So that's all that I came to talk about today. Any other questions come up, Tim? Any questions from you?
No other questions at the current time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to bring up the next slide then. If anybody has any questions, then you can add them now. I'll give you a minute to put those in. If you want to talk any more about this or this topic or anything related to improving, there's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm very interested in the topic of teaching and education, and so would love to talk to other people about it if they want to chat.
And as you've heard from Eric, we definitely are constantly investing in our improvers within improving, and there's lots of opportunities to learn and grow with us. So once again, if you're interested in joining our team, we'd love to talk with you, and I'm sure Eric would love to talk to you about that as well. So Eric, thank you very much for taking time today, for sharing your experiences in teaching adults. And we appreciate all of you taking time to join us over the lunch hour today. And please join us next week when we'll be back with another Improving Talks.
Thanks all.